What if the disconnect between leadership and the production floor isn't because either side is wrong? What if they're simply looking at two completely different realities? Upper leadership is accountable to the board and shareholders. They're expected to deliver numbers such as revenue, margins, cost savings, EBITDA, profitability, and those numbers typically come through traditional cost accounting. Financial measures that are largely backward looking and can take time to fully reflect what's actually happening inside the operation. But the production floor is living in a completely different reality. They're seeing today's bottlenecks, today's constraints, today's lost capacity, and today's opportunities to improve throughput. That's where throughput accounting can offer a very different perspective, one that is very much focused on how operational decisions affect future performance and the organization's ability to generate money. But here's the problem. Most manufacturing leaders don't have access to throughput-based information, and some don't even know to ask for it. So leadership looks at the financial results and sees one reality, while production floor sees another. And when these two realities aren't aligned, neither side has the complete picture. I believe that's another piece of the radical alignment puzzle, because you can't align leadership around the future if you're only measuring the past. And that's what we're going to explore this week. If you believe America can lead the world in manufacturing again, join me, join the movement. Let me ask you a question. What if I told you that your manufacturing facility might be capable of producing significantly more than it produces today, without hiring another person, without buying another machine, and without adding another square foot of manufacturing space? Would you believe me? Because after more than 20 years working in aerospace, defense, automotive, electronics, battery fabrication, and advanced manufacturing, I've seen it over and over again. There is capacity inside American manufacturing organizations that we've simply not realized. And sometimes that capacity is hiding in places that don't show up on the financial statements. It's hiding in the hours spent fighting emergencies. It's hiding in rework, defects, and material that's sitting somewhere for weeks waiting for the next step. It's hiding in engineers who should be working on improvements but are spending their afternoons troubleshooting problems that have already happened before. In supervisors who should be developing their people but are running around trying to get today's production back on schedule. And it's hiding in something even bigger: the opportunity costs of everything we don't get done because we're constantly dealing with what already went wrong. That's what I want to talk about today, because I think we need to change the way we think about productivity in American manufacturing. For a lot of American manufacturers, the strategy seems to become reactive by necessity. The economy slows down, orders decrease, leadership looks at the numbers, and one of the fastest things they can control is headcount. So people get laid off. Then demand comes back and the company needs those people again, so they hire, they train, they ramp up, and eventually another downturn comes. The cycle starts all over again. Sometimes companies genuinely have to make incredibly difficult decisions. I'm not pretending there is never a legitimate reason for a layoff. But I do think we need to ask ourselves a very uncomfortable question. Why have layoffs become such a predictable part of the manufacturing cycle? Because if we're repeatedly responding to predictive market cycles with the same reactive solution, that's not a real strategy. That's a reaction. And there is tremendous cost to that reaction that doesn't necessarily show up on the spreadsheet. Because every time you lay off experienced people, you don't just lose labor, you lose knowledge, experience, reputation. You lose the person who knew why a particular process was designed the way it was. You lose the person who could walk over to a machine and know something wasn't right before the problem became obvious. And you lose trust. When the workforce sees that layoffs are the company's first response to a downturn, people learn something. They learn that their future with the company isn't necessarily secure. And that changes how people behave. They protect themselves, their knowledge. They become less willing to speak up, less willing to take risks, and less willing to invest emotionally in the long-term success of the organization. That's not because they don't care. It's because they've learned to protect themselves. And that's why I believe respect for people and trust are not soft concepts in manufacturing. They're operational assets. They're foundational to continuous improvement. They're foundational to efficiency. And they're foundational to creating additional capacity. If you want people to help you build a better manufacturing company, they have to believe there is going to be a future for them in that company. And this is where I want to take this a step further, because I think we're making another short-sighted reactive decision in American manufacturing. And it's happening inside our continuous improvement programs. We're doing Kaizens, Lean, Six Sigma, and process improvements. We're asking people to identify waste and solve problems, but then we don't fully recognize what those improvements actually created. That is a huge problem, because if the results of a Kaizen aren't translated into a format that upper leadership can understand, quantify, and use to make decisions, the value can essentially become invisible. And when something becomes invisible to decision makers, it becomes very difficult to prioritize. And when it isn't prioritized, resources go somewhere else. That's the part I think we've been missing. I've facilitated Kaizens at several different companies, and in many of them, there was some reduction in scrap and fewer defects. Those are important, but sometimes the most important thing that happens isn't the thing that's easiest to put into a financial report. I remember one Kaizen in particular. There was material sitting at the beginning of a process for weeks, sometimes months, just waiting and waiting. The material wasn't defective. The operators weren't doing anything wrong. The problem was that we had a constraint, a bottleneck. So it accumulated. And when material sits, it creates all kinds of hidden consequences. It has to be handled, moved, stored, tracked. People have to manage it, inventory builds, and most importantly, the customer's waiting. We worked on the process together, and we dramatically reduced the amount of time that material was sitting there. Instead of weeks or months, it was down to days. Think about what that means. Less handling, less inventory sitting idle, better material flow, shorter lead time, better on-time delivery. More predictable production and potentially more capacity. That's a tremendous improvement. But here's the problem. Those benefits aren't necessarily sitting neatly inside a traditional financial report like cost accounting. They don't always show up as a single line item that says, this Kaizen created X dollars of value. And if that information isn't readily available, if it takes too long to calculate, if it isn't translated into the language upper leadership uses to make strategic decisions, then what happens? The value gets discounted. Not necessarily because leadership doesn't care or doesn't believe in continuous improvement, but because they can't see it. And that's a distinction that's incredibly important. Imagine you're the CEO. You're sitting in a board meeting, and the board wants to know where you're putting resources. Your shareholders want to know what you're doing to improve margins and grow the business. You've got financial numbers in front of you. You've got forecasts, you've got budgets, you've got cost reduction targets, and someone comes into that meeting and says, we completed a Kaizen and it reduced material waiting time from months to days. That's great. But the next question is probably going to be, how much did it save? And if the answer is we're still trying to calculate it, or we don't really have a number, or we think it probably created significant capacity, but we can't quantify that yet, then the board, or the CEO, the stakeholders are going to ask, what else can we spend this money on that we can quantify? And that's where I think American manufacturing has gotten itself into trouble. Because the things that are easiest to quantify aren't necessarily the things that create the most value. We can easily see a headcount reduction. We can see a reduction in a purchase price. We can see a reduction in scrap. We can see a budget cut. But capacity creation can be much harder to see. And if we consistently prioritize what is easiest to measure over what is most valuable, we can end up making very short-sighted decisions. This is why I think discounting Kaizen results, because we haven't quantified them properly, is every bit as short-sighted as jumping to layoffs every time the market has a downturn. Both decisions are reactive. One says demand is down, what can we cut? The other says we can't easily quantify this improvement, so what else can we cut? And both miss the bigger question. What could we build if we fully realize the capacity already inside this organization? That's the question I want American manufacturing leaders to start asking. Because when you fully support continuous improvement, something different begins to happen. You don't just get a better process, more capacity, better delivery, more predictable production, customer satisfaction, more opportunity to take on work, more opportunities to grow revenue, and eventually you get more choices. Imagine an American manufacturer that has created significant additional capacity. Now the company has choices, more flexibility, but none of that happens if we're constantly operating from scarcity, if every improvement is viewed as an opportunity to eliminate someone. People will stop trusting the organization. And if every Kaizen is judged only by the easiest savings numbers to calculate, we will systematically underinvest in the very thing capable of creating the capacity we need. That's the cycle we have to break. And this is where my idea of radical alignment comes in. We have decades of knowledge about continuous improvement. The tools aren't the problem. The problem is the environment in which we're trying to use them. If the CEO says continuous improvement is strategically important, but the CFO only recognizes immediate cost savings, and the VP of operations is measured on this quarter's numbers, and middle management doesn't have time to support Kaizen. And supervisors are constantly fighting emergencies, and employees believe improvement might eventually cost them their jobs. How can we possibly expect these tools to reach their full potential? We can't. And this is what's been happening in American manufacturing facilities for decades. The entire leadership system has to align around the same objective. Everybody has to understand we're not doing this to make people work harder. We're doing it to create capacity and make the company stronger. We're doing it so growth becomes possible. So the next downturn doesn't automatically mean layoffs. We're doing it so people can build careers here, and so American manufacturing can compete. That's radical alignment. So here's your exercise this week. Go to the production floor. and ask 3 people one question. What is the biggest thing that gets in the way of you doing your best work? And then listen. Don't defend the process. Don't explain why it can't be fixed. Don't tell them what management is already doing. Just listen. Then take what you hear and ask yourself, where are we losing capacity because we've allowed this problem to become normal? Then, if we solve this problem permanently, what would that make possible? That's the mindset shift. I believe American manufacturing has enormous untapped capacity, but we aren't going to unlock it by asking our people to work harder. They're already working hard. We're going to unlock it by removing the barriers that prevent them from doing what they're capable of doing. We're going to unlock it by giving continuous improvement the resources and leadership support it deserves. And I believe that shift could fundamentally change American manufacturing. I want us to become the strongest version of ourselves, our innovation, our courage, our entrepreneurial spirit, our willingness to solve impossible problems, combined with the discipline, trust, prevention, and continuous improvement necessary to build systems that actually support these strengths. I believe the tools are already here. I believe the people are already here. And I believe the capacity is already here. What we've been missing is the alignment to fully realize it. And that's what I'm here to help build. And if you believe America can lead the world in manufacturing again, join me, join the movement. What if your CEO and your production floor are both telling the truth, but they're looking at 2 completely different realities? Think about that for a minute. Your executive team is looking at revenue. They're looking at margins, EBITDA, cost savings, forecasts, budgets, and whether the company is hitting its targets. And they should be. That's what they're accountable for. To the board, to shareholders, they're accountable to employees, customers, and the long-term financial health of the company. But now walk out onto the production floor. The people there are experiencing something completely different, the emergency that's about to happen before it ever shows up on a financial statement. And I think this difference in perspective is one of the reasons we've created such a disconnect between leadership and the production floor. It's not necessarily because leadership doesn't care, and it's not because the people on the production floor don't understand the business. It's because they're often looking at the company through completely different lenses. And I believe that's something we have to address if we're serious about creating the next American manufacturing renaissance through radical alignment. The problem is what happens when those numbers become the only lens leadership has for understanding what's happening operationally. Because those financial numbers are largely telling you about what has already happened. By the time you see the impact in the financial results, the operational decisions that created that result may have happened weeks or months earlier. And that's where things get interesting. Because the factory isn't living in the past, the factory is living in the present. And in many ways, it's telling you about the future. Think about the people closest to the work. The operator knows when a machine doesn't sound right. A supervisor knows when a process is beginning to fall behind. An engineer knows when a recurring issue is consuming more resources than it should. A production manager knows which constraint is starting to threaten the schedule, and the planner knows that a particular shortage is going to create a problem 3 weeks from now. None of those things necessarily show up in your financial statements today, but they are incredibly important pieces of information about what your financial results are going to look like tomorrow. That's the distinction I want upper leadership to start thinking about. Your financial department can tell you what happened. Your operation can tell you what's coming. And if leadership only has the first piece of information, they're making decisions with an incomplete picture. This is where throughput accounting becomes so interesting. I'm not suggesting that every CEO needs to become an accountant. I'm not suggesting that traditional cost accounting should disappear. I'm saying that there is another lens that manufacturing leaders should understand. Throughput accounting focuses much more heavily on the impact improvements make on future revenue. And that changes the questions you ask. Instead of, how much does this department cost? You begin asking, what is limiting the system's ability to generate more revenue in the future? Where is your constraint? Where are we losing capacity? What decisions will increase throughput? What decision might make one department look efficient while actually making the overall system worse? Those are very different questions, and they lead to very different decisions. Here's an example. Let's say you have a manufacturing operation with 3 major steps: Department A, Department B, Department C. Department A discovers a way to increase its productivity by 20%. Fantastic. The department celebrates, management celebrates, the efficiency number goes up. Everyone looks good. But Department B is the constraint. It can't process the additional work coming from Department A. So now you've increased the amount of work sitting in front of Department B. You've increased work in process. You've increased waiting and potentially increased handling. You've also potentially increased inventory, and you've accomplished almost nothing for the customer. Department A got more efficient, but the company didn't necessarily get more productive. That's an incredibly important distinction because a manufacturing company is not a collection of independent departments trying to win their individual metrics. It's one system. And if one part of the system wins while the overall system doesn't improve, we haven't really won. We've optimized a piece of the machine instead of the machine itself. Let me give you a real example from my own experience, because this isn't just a theoretical discussion for me. I've facilitated Kaizens in different manufacturing environments, and I've seen some very significant improvements come out of them. Sometimes the improvement is obvious. You reduce scrap, you reduce defects, you reduce material waste, and those savings are relatively easy to calculate and reconcile with finance. But some of the biggest improvements aren't nearly as easy to see on a traditional financial report. One Kaizen I facilitated resulted in a 40% reduction in the amount of time required to train new employees. Think about that for a minute. Think about what that means. A new employee could become effective faster, the company could get productive capacity online sooner, and experienced employees spent less time training and more time doing the work. But here's what happened. When the results were presented upward through the organization, the only number that made it to upper management was the reduction in scrap. And yes, there was a scrap reduction. That was real, but it was only one piece of the value that had been created. I actually went to finance and verified the hourly labor rate for the factory workforce. I used that number to calculate the value of the time we were freeing up and the increased capacity created by getting people trained and productive faster. When I calculated that value, the increased capacity and throughput opportunity was more than 8 times the value of the scrap reduction alone. Think about that. The improvement created substantially more value than the number upper leadership was being shown. And that matters because this isn't just a reporting problem, it's a business problem. Leadership may conclude that the Kaizen created a relatively modest return. They may look at that result and say, that's good, but is it really worth investing more resources into this? Meanwhile, the organization has created a much larger capacity opportunity that isn't being recognized. And there's another problem here that I think is even more important. When middle management doesn't feel comfortable presenting the full economic value of an improvement to upper leadership, you've created a barrier between reality and decision making. The people closest to the improvement know what it actually created. Middle management may know what it actually created, but the information gets translated into whatever number is easiest to defend. And eventually, upper leadership and the board are making decisions based on an incomplete picture of the value the organization is actually creating. That's misleading and it's bad business. Because now you've created this strange situation where one of the best uses of your organization's time. The people doing the work know its value. The production floor feels the improvement. The organization gains capacity, but the financial reporting structure doesn't necessarily make that value visible. So the improvement gets undervalued. And when improvements are consistently undervalued, what happens? People stop investing in them. Kaizens start to become something people do because it's expected. Continuous improvement becomes just another initiative. And eventually, people start asking, why are we spending all this time on improvement when leadership only cares about the numbers? But here's the irony. Leadership does care about the numbers. The problem is that we're not always giving leadership the right numbers to make the right decision. So the information stops flowing. And when information stops flowing, leadership's view of reality gets narrower. This is where I think manufacturing leaders need to challenge themselves. So now let's come back to the two realities. Leadership is looking at the financial results. The production floor is looking at the operational reality. Leadership sees that the company hit the monthly target, but the production floor knows what it took to get there. Leadership sees that the customer order shipped, but the production floor knows how many workarounds were required to make it happen. Leadership sees the improvement in one department's efficiency. The production floor may know that the constraint didn't change at all. Leadership sees the numbers. The workforce experiences the system. And here's where I want to be very careful. That's exactly why the information needs to change. So if you're a manufacturing leader watching this, I want to give you a few questions to take back to your team. Don't just ask, did we hit the number? Ask, what constrained us from producing more? Don't just ask, why did we miss the schedule? Ask, what did the production floor see coming that leadership didn't? Don't wonder, how much did this problem cost? Find out, what future capacity are we losing because we haven't permanently solved it? And don't just ask, how efficient is this department? Ask, is this improvement making the entire system more capable or just one department? And here's the question I might ask most often. What are our financial numbers not telling us? Because I think that's where some of the biggest opportunities in American manufacturing are hiding. And this brings us back to the theme we've been talking about. Scarcity versus abundance. If leadership sees productivity primarily as a cost equation, the natural question becomes, how much labor can we eliminate? But what happens when leadership starts seeing productivity as a capacity equation? Now the question becomes, how much more can we create? How many more customers can we serve? Products can we build? Revenue can we generate? How much more can we invest in our people? How many more career opportunities can we create? More resilient can we make the company? That's a completely different mindset. And I believe American manufacturing desperately needs that shift because we don't have to choose between productivity and people. We don't have to choose between profitability and job security. We don't have to choose between efficiency and a fulfilling workforce. The opportunity is create enough alignment that those things actually reinforce one another. And this is why I think throughput accounting can be so valuable. Not because it replaces traditional cost accounting, it doesn't, and not because every manufacturing leader needs to become an expert in it, but because it can give leadership another way to understand the economic consequences of operational decisions. It can help connect what the production floor is seeing with what the executive team needs to understand. Instead of only asking, what did this improvement save us? We can also ask, what did this improvement allow us to do? That's a very different thought process. It moves the conversation from historical cost to future opportunity, from expense to capacity, from scarcity to growth. And that is exactly the conversation I want more American manufacturers to have. And that's what I mean when I talk about radical alignment. It's not another lean tool or Six Sigma initiative or software package. It's not another poster on the wall or leadership philosophy. It's the decision to align the information, incentives, measurements, priorities, and behaviors of the organization around one common objective, creating a stronger, more capable, more abundant company. And when leadership starts seeing the entire system, when information flows freely, when employees trust that improvement isn't going to automatically threaten their livelihood, when productivity creates capacity instead of simply eliminating labor, when departments stop optimizing themselves and start optimizing the whole, something changes. The organization starts becoming capable of growth without constantly requiring more people, more buildings, more equipment, or more heroics. That's the opportunity. Your financial statements matter, as does EBITDA, margins, and cost structure. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But if those are the only lenses leadership has for understanding the business, they're missing an enormous amount of information. Your factory is constantly telling you what your financial statements haven't told you yet. Are you listening to your factory? Because if we're going to move American manufacturing from scarcity to abundance, if we're going to create companies where productivity creates opportunity instead of fear, if we're going to build organizations where people can have fulfilling careers instead of constantly wondering when the next restructuring is coming, we have to start seeing the entire system. We have to connect the boardroom to the production floor. We have to connect financial performance with the operational reality. And we have to create leadership alignment around the future, not just accountability for the past. And I believe that's possible. I believe American manufacturing has enormous untapped capacity. And I believe our best manufacturing days are still ahead of us. Every week, I'm going to keep showing up here and exploring the ideas, leadership practices, and systems that I believe can help us get there. If you believe America can lead the world in manufacturing again, join me. Join the movement. It's